7 years ago, I built the rainwater system on this place and made a video about it, and in that video, everything was new and clean and working exactly the way I said it would. Today, I'm going to open up every part of it and tell you what broke. Because it did break in 3 separate places, and 2 of those were my fault rather than the equipment's. If you want the version of off-grid content where somebody comes back and grades their own homework, subscribe, because I intend to keep doing this with everything I've built out here. Here's what bothers me about this whole genre, and I include my own videos in it. Almost every build video you have ever watched was filmed the week the build was finished. That's when it looks best, that's when the person is proudest of it, and that's when nobody knows anything yet. The interesting information about a system does not exist at week 1. It shows up somewhere around year 4, and by then everybody's moved on to filming the next project. And I understand why it works that way. A finished build is exciting. A 7-year-old build with a slow leak and a plugged drain is not exciting, and nobody's algorithm is going to reward me for standing here telling you about a hardened O-ring. But if you're planning to build one of these yourself, the O-ring is worth more to you than the build footage was. The build tells you whether a thing can be made. Only time tells you whether it can be kept. The other reason nobody does this is that it requires admitting you were wrong about something on camera, in public, about a thing you previously recommended. Which I'm about to do 3 times. So this is the boring video. Year 7. Quick refresher on what the thing is. Rain lands on a metal roof, runs through gutters into screened downspouts, passes a first flush diverter that dumps the dirty opening minutes of a storm and goes into storage. From storage, it gravity feeds out to where I need it. There's no pump in the drinking path, and there are almost no moving parts in the whole system, which was deliberate and which I still think was the best decision I made. 7 years is a useful number for this, and not an arbitrary one. It's long enough for the slow stuff to show, ooze damage, rubber going hard, sediment building to a depth that matters, and it's also long enough for the human side to run its full course. Enthusiasm has a half-life. Whatever routine you set up on day 1, 7 years, is enough time for you to keep it, then loosen it, then quietly drop it, then forget you ever had it. Both of those clocks have now run, and this is the report. All right, failure number 1, and it's the one I'm least proud of. The first flush diverter. The idea is simple. The first water off a roof in a storm carries the dust, pollen, bird mess, and general grit that accumulated since the last rain. So you route that opening volume into a separate chamber that fills up and closes itself off. And only after it's full does the clean water start going to your tanks. Then between storms, it slowly drains itself out through a small orifice and resets. I'll say in passing that first flush diverters are not universally loved in the rainwater world, and there are professionals who argue they add a maintenance item and a failure point for a benefit you could get more reliably with good screening and a sensible draw-off height. Having now been the guy whose diverter quietly stopped working for 2 years, I have some sympathy for that view. It's not that the device is bad. It's that a device which only works if you keep visiting it is a different kind of thing than a device that just works. It worked beautifully for about 3 years. What happened is that it needs cleaning, and it needs cleaning specifically because it's doing its job. All the debris it caught is sitting in it. And I cleaned it faithfully the first season, less faithfully the second. And by year 3, I had stopped thinking about it. It was around the side of the building, it wasn't in my way, and nothing about it announced that it needed attention. Eventually, the drain orifice plugged. Once that's plugged, the chamber never empties. And a permanently full first flush diverter is not a first flush diverter. It's a pipe. Every storm just bypassed straight past it into the tanks. So for something like 2 years, I had a diverter that I believed was protecting my water and was in fact doing nothing at all. That's a behavioral failure, not a mechanical one. The part was fine. I checked, I pulled it apart, and the housing is in perfect condition. The design assumed a person who would keep showing up, and after 3 years that person was me, and I didn't. And I want to sit on that for a second, because it's the most useful thing in this video and it's easy to skip past. When I built this, I read about first flush diverters, decided they were worth having, installed one, and then filed the whole matter under done. In my head, that was a solved problem. It stayed solved in my head for 4 more years than it stayed solved in reality. There was no alarm. Nothing dripped, nothing stopped working, no tap ran dry. The system kept delivering water the entire time, and the only thing that changed was that the water was dirtier than I believed it was. That's the dangerous kind of failure, the kind with no symptom. If it had leaked, I'd have fixed it in a weekend. Because it just quietly stopped protecting me, it went on for years. I found it, incidentally, only because I was going around getting footage for this video, which is an uncomfortable thing to say out loud on the video in question. Which leads directly into failure number 2, because they're connected. Sludge. I did not look inside the bottom of my storage until year 5. 5 years. And what's down there is a layer of fine sediment and biofilm, dust that came off the roof. Pollen. The fine material too small for any screen, all of it settled out and turned into a soft, dark layer across the floor. It's not dramatic to look at, which is part of why it goes unnoticed. It's not a sewer. It's a brownish-gray layer, soft, more like silt off a creek bottom than anything alarming, and the water sitting above it looks completely clean. That's the thing to understand. The water can look perfect while there's a considerable accumulation underneath it doing whatever it's doing. Nothing about drawing a glass off the tap tells you it's there. The recommendation you'll find from health authorities is to inspect for accumulated sediment every 2 to 3 years and clean it out when the floor is covered. I went 5, with a broken first flush for 2 of them, so I got a fairly generous demonstration of what happens when you don't. Now, here's where I have to be fair, because the sludge question is more contested than I expected when I went looking. The traditional line is that it's a contamination source and a bacterial breeding ground, which is why the 2 to 3 year inspection advice exists. But there's a real body of research suggesting the biofilm in a rainwater tank is mostly harmless environmental bacteria, that it's living in a low-nutrient environment, so it's aggressive about consuming what does come in, and that it actively pulls lead and other heavy metals out of the water column, meaning the layer might be doing some water treatment for you. I'm not qualified to settle that, and I'm not going to pretend to. What I'll say is the practical version that both camps agree on: don't stir it up and don't draw from it. And I'll add the thing I actually did about it, which is test the water rather than guess. That's the only way any of this stops being an argument. I've talked before on this channel about how clear and cold and coming off my own roof tells you exactly nothing about what's in water. And a lab test is not expensive, and it converts a debate into a number. Mine came back fine, which is the boring outcome and the one I wanted, and I'd rather know that than have a strong opinion about biofilm. Which brings up the single best design decision in this entire system, and I'd like to claim I made it on purpose. My draw-off sits several inches up off the floor rather than at the very bottom. That means the settled layer stays settled, and the water I actually use comes off the clean column above it. If I'd put that outlet at the floor like a person thinking about drainage rather than about water quality, I'd have been drinking the bottom of the tank for 7 years. Getting the layer out when I finally did it was less dramatic than I'd built it up to be. You don't have to drain and scrub. The usual approach is to vacuum the floor while leaving the water in place, which pulls the sediment off without disturbing the rest of it or wasting a full tank. That's a job you can do yourself with the right setup, and it's also a job people hire out. One thing I do want to say seriously, because this is where the injuries in this hobby actually happen. A water tank is a confined space. People die in them, not from the water, but from getting into an enclosed container with poor air, alone, with nobody who knows they're in there. If you ever find yourself thinking about climbing inside one to scrub it, that's the moment to stop and either vacuum it from outside or pay somebody who does this for a living and has the gear for it. There is no amount of sediment worth that. Failure number 3 is the one that actually leaked, and it's the sun. Everything on the outside of this system that sits in daylight has been getting hit for 7 summers. And the story on Uve is more nuanced than I assumed. On the PVC pipe, the damage turns out to be surprisingly shallow, a few thousandths of an inch of yellowed, chalky, brittle surface, and the core keeps its strength. Industry testing on this is pretty consistent. Pipe that looks terrible after years in the sun still holds pressure fine. So the pipe is ugly, and it's structurally okay. There is one practical consequence of that surface brittleness, though, and I ran into it while doing the repairs for this video. Old sun-exposed pipe doesn't cut clean, and it doesn't take a fitting as nicely. It chips at the edge, the surface is chalky enough that cement doesn't bite the way it should, and you end up wiping the surface back to fresh material before you can trust a joint. So the pipe is fine right up until the day you need to modify it, and then it makes you work. The rubber is a different story. Gaskets, seals, the O-ring in a bulkhead fitting, anything flexible, those harden. They lose their give, they take a set, and eventually they stop sealing. That's where my leak came from, not a cracked pipe, not a failed tank. A hardened gasket in a fitting, weeping slowly enough that I didn't notice for a while, and only found because of a persistent damp patch that I'd been telling myself was condensation. The fix on the pipe, by the way, costs almost nothing, and I wish I'd done it on day 1. A coat of light-colored latex paint. Water-based, 1 coat, and it blocks the UV entirely. People who paint their exposed plastic get decades out of it, while the unpainted stuff next to it goes chalky. That's a 2-hour job I skipped 7 years ago, and I'm doing it this month. The gaskets are worth 1 more minute, because the lesson generalizes past this system. Anything rubber in the path of sunlight is on a clock, and the clock is a lot shorter than the clock on the hard parts around it. 7 years is squarely in the range where you should expect to be replacing seals, and the failure is gradual, it doesn't split open, it just stops being springy, takes a permanent shape, and eventually weeps. So when you're walking a system like this, don't look for broken things. Look for damp. A patch of ground that stays dark, a bit of algae growing on a fitting that has no business being wet. A mineral streak down the side of something. Those are gaskets telling you about themselves months before they'll actually fail, and if you catch one at the streak stage, it's a $2 part and 10 minutes. So that's 3 failures. Let me hear yours. If you've got a system more than about 5 years old, tell me in the comments what went first. Because I suspect there's a pattern here, and it's mostly gaskets and mostly neglect. Now the other side of the ledger, because a fair audit has to include what held up. The tanks are fine. Actually fine. Some fading on the sunny side and no loss of function, which tracks with what quality of stabilized poly is supposed to do, The service life on decent tanks is generally quoted somewhere in the 10 to 20 year range, and mine are clearly not near the end of theirs. Worth noting what I'm looking for when I say fine, since the tank didn't explode, isn't much of an inspection. I'm checking the walls for deep gouges or actual cracking rather than surface fading, which is normal and cosmetic. I'm looking at the area around every fitting, because that's where stress concentrates, and where a tank will tell you first if it's unhappy. And I'm checking that the base is still level and fully supporting the bottom. Because a tank sitting on ground that's settled unevenly is carrying its own weight in a way it was never designed to. Mine's on a compacted pad, and it hasn't moved. The gravity feed is fine, because gravity does not wear out. 7 years, no pump, no electricity, no failure mode beyond a blockage. Every part of this system that had no moving parts is exactly as good as the day I built it. Every part that failed either required a person to maintain it or contained something flexible. That is the actual lesson of 7 years, and it took me 7 years to see it clearly. The screens held up too, and they earned their keep. Every bit of debris a screen stops at the gutter is debris that never becomes sludge on a tank floor 5 years later, and the screens are the one maintenance item I did keep up with, mostly because they're visible from where I park. Here's what I'd build differently. I'd design for the person who forgets. That's the big one. I built this for an attentive owner, and the attentive owner lasted about 2 seasons before he got busy. So, put the maintenance items where you physically trip over them, not tucked around the side of a building. Make the first flush drain oversized so a partial clog doesn't take it out. Put a real inspection port in the storage that a person can open in 5 minutes without dismantling anything, because a 5-minute inspection happens and a 2-hour inspection does not. The general principle, if there is one, is that every maintenance task has a difficulty threshold above which it silently stops happening. And that threshold is much lower than anybody thinks when they're standing there full of enthusiasm on build day. On build day, you'd happily spend an hour a month on this thing. Year 4, you will not. So the design question isn't, can this be maintained? It's, will this get maintained by a tired version of me in November? Those are very different specifications, and I built to the wrong one. That's Walt's rule, actually. He used to say, if you can't reach it, you won't fix it. He said it about greasing equipment, and it turns out it's about everything. The other half of that is writing it down. I now keep a card in the shed with 4 things on it, and the month each one is due: screens, first flush, a walk of the plumbing looking for damp, and an inspection of the tank floor every other year. That's it. 4 lines. I resisted the idea of a maintenance schedule for years because it felt like something a person with a clipboard would do rather than something a person with a shovel would do. And that was pure vanity on my part. The card takes 10 seconds to read, and it's the only reason any of this gets done now. I'd also put more of the plumbing in shade, or at least paint it from day one. And I'd have bought a small bag of spare gaskets when I built it, because the reason my leak went on for a couple of weeks after I found it is that I didn't have the right O-ring, and I wasn't going to town for one. So the verdict. Does it still work? Yes, it works today. It has worked essentially continuously for 7 years, and it has never once left me completely without water. The closest it came was one September when it got low enough that I was being careful. In 7 years, it has cost me a handful of gaskets, 1 afternoon of sludge removal, and a first flush rebuild. That's it. Against 7 years of not buying or hauling water, that's about as good a return as anything I've built out here. And I want to put that in proportion, because I've spent most of this video on the failures. 3 problems in 7 years, none of which stopped the water, all of which were fixable in an afternoon with parts from a hardware store. That's a good system. If somebody told me before I built it that this was the worst I'd face by year 7, I'd have started digging immediately. But it does not work as well as it did on the day I filmed it, and it never was going to. It has been quietly getting slightly worse the entire time, in ways I couldn't see, and what I found this month was not one big failure. It was 7 years of very small ones sitting on top of each other. And here's the part I keep chewing on. If you'd asked me a month ago how the system was doing, I'd have told you it was doing great, and I'd have meant it, and I'd have been wrong in 3 specific ways. Not because I'm careless. I don't think I'm careless. But because a thing that keeps delivering water gives you no reason to look at it. Working is not the same as healthy. I had confused those two for about 4 years. Which is, I think, the whole point of doing this. A system isn't something you finish. It's something you keep. And the difference between a build that lasts 7 years and one that lasts 30 isn't the quality of the parts. It's whether the person who owns it can be bothered, and whether whoever designed it made that easy or made it hard. Walt kept things running for decades that had no business still running, and I understand now that it wasn't because he was good at fixing things. It was because he looked at them. I'll put a couple videos up here for you, including the original build if you want to see what it looked like new. And I'll come back and do this again at year 10, whether it's interesting or not. My guess is the tanks will still be fine, the gaskets will need doing again, and there'll be something I haven't thought of yet. I'm Cole Ashford. Thank you for listening.